Labadiena, ponios ir ponai.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you here, both who are online and who have gathered at the conference hall to the event called Fit for 2050, Strengthening Decision-Making and Anticipatory Governance for Long-Term Development of Lithuania. This conference has been organized with the Office of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania and Strata, Government Strategic Center. Our experts will share insights how Lithuania is doing when it comes to decision-making. They will look at the current situation. They will look at the overview that has been carried out. They will also deal with the recommendations that were given for Lithuania. Before we start the conference, I'll briefly mention some technical details. As we have some foreign guests, the interpretation from English into Lithuanian and from Lithuanian into English is provided. Those who need the interpretation services, please open the folders that are in front of you. And whenever you need interpretation, simply take out the headset from the table and choose the channel that you need, while those who are watching us online will be able to choose again whether to listen to the floor or listen to the interpretation. Once you understand what is going on, once you understand the subject, you will be able to ask questions. We will use the slide platform for raising questions. You will later on see the code, and you will be able to submit their questions for the panel during the conference. But this will be later on, once we start our panel discussions. Welcome addresses are of particular importance, and I'm very happy that we have honorable guests. Let me now give the floor to the Deputy Speaker of the Seimas, Algirdas Saudargas. Julius Sabatauskas. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Mr. Jeffrey Schlagenhauf, Madam Prime Minister, I truly want to express my gratitude on behalf of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania for the initiative to hold this event that is dedicated to improve public governance. From the restoration of independence of the Republic of Lithuania, the Seimas has focused greatly on the quality of legislation. From the very beginning, the Seimas adopted the framework of the law on the legislative framework of the Republic of Lithuania. Over the legislative periods, members of the Seimas tried to improve our legal framework. Some of the laws that we had were taken from the then Soviet Union. We therefore had to replace them in order to be able to join the European Union and NATO. This required titanic efforts on the part of the members of the Seimas and government of the Republic of Lithuania. We had to amend the laws, and we also had to adjust the laws to the norms of the EU. It is therefore natural that we were forced into rushing when we adopted certain laws. That's why I have to admit, sometimes have the laws that are not of very high quality. Currently, we face different challenges, which include the COVID pandemic, legal inflation, and so on. And the parliament of this parliamentary term has undertaken to address the challenges. We have established the Committee for Future. We also have some working groups that try to address the problems related to legal inflation. When it comes to cooperation with international organizations and the OECD in particular, I'd like to note that I had a meeting with the Secretary General of the OECD in November, and I will be very happy to hear the expert insights. We also think that there is great value in the overview. We are also very happy that we have just received some funding under the European Commission programs, which makes it possible for Lithuania to improve its legislative procedure. The leadership of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania understands the challenges that the public government faces with. The legislative burden is very high, as I have mentioned. We therefore have to address the issue of reducing the legislative inflation. I wish a productive conference to you and interesting debate. Thank you.
I thank Mr. Julius Sabatauskas, and now I would like to give the floor to Prime Minister Ingrida Šimonytė. Dear Deputy Speaker of the Seimas, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD, Honorable Director General of the European Commission, ladies and gentlemen, participants of the conference, and those who follow us online. It is a pleasure to welcome you all. It is a great opportunity to escape from everyday challenges and address the future of our country. We had more occasions like this in different other events, and they are enabled. They are done in the framework of Lithuania 2050 program. We have the opportunity to address the future of Lithuania through cooperation between Lithuania and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. This organization, in this case, as well as in other cases, allows us to look at the problems of public governance and also is a channel for exchange and networking of expertise. First of all, I would like to thank the OECD for their report, Evidence-Based Policy Making and Policy Evaluation at the Center of Government. The title is really long, but its substance is very meaningful, and I thank for the preparation of this report. The program of the 18th government of the Republic of Lithuania, approved almost a year ago, contains a general commitment of the government to develop a knowledge-based policy and systematically evaluate legislation. We will listen carefully to the OECD's assessment of how we're doing. It will be a wide evaluation and also advice on what we can do better. In my opinion, I've mentioned this on several occasions, one of our main problems is that we have too large a legislative mill. It consumes time that could be used to seek knowledge, development of skills of civil servants in order to make fewer but more high-quality solutions. Mr. Sabatauskas said named the term legislative inflation. It is a correct term. It is related not only with the fact that it is time-consuming from building competencies and skills upgrading, but it is related to a lack of deficit, a deficit of trust. Our program of the government also discusses this problem. The legislative practice that we have today was very well fitting some 10 or 30 years ago. It served a certain function in a new and emerging state. When we developed our legislation from scratch and by transposing EU legislation, we were seeking to defend the legal system, laws, and other legal acts from the attempts of interest groups to exert influence, which is unnecessary. As state institutions became stronger, it became easier to maximize the public interest through legislation. I believe that the time has changed. We have gained much experience, and we have a certain value foundations that could help us to look for ways to reduce gold plating. Well, we will have an opportunity to discuss this factor during our discussion. I think that this event is a good opportunity to continue the reflection on the future of the Lithuanian state. We started those discussions a month ago. It was an inaugural event on the National Progress Strategy Lithuania 2050. Today we will be talking about strengthening governance for the future, the direction we took in the Seimas with the establishment of the Committee for the Future. I believe that this direction has to be developed and deepened, and discussions on the future governance is a part of that. Therefore, I thank very much the Parliament which invited us here to discuss issues of importance and of concern to our state and our society. Thank you very much. May we all have a good and interesting conference. I thank Madam Prime Minister. And now we will have a welcome address by our guests. I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Jeffrey Schlagenhau, Deputy Secretary General of the OECD.
Thank you very much. Madam Prime Minister, Madam Speaker of the Parliament, Director General of DG Reform. It's a great pleasure to participate in today's event to launch the OECD report on mobilizing evidence at the center of government in Lithuania. strengthening decision-making and policy evaluation for long-term development. I want to thank colleagues in the Office of Government, the ministries, academia, and public institutions, and also Strata and its director for having embarked on this journey with us. Thank you to our colleagues from Finland for joining us today. This report reflects an ambitious agenda, which has benefited from the expertise of the OECD, the partnership with the European Commission, and the expertise of our member countries, including Canada, Ireland, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, Finland, Denmark, the Netherlands, and Norway. Lithuania is not alone with this agenda. In my own country, the United States, the government is actively pursuing the implementation of the Foundations for Evidence-Based Policymaking Act of 2018. As you well know, pursuing long-term development requires a whole-of-society effort driven from the center of government. Mobilizing evidence for decision-making is crucial to achieving broad societal goals, improving well-being, and preserving trust in public institutions. The COVID-19 crisis has challenged us all in this regard, as it has highlighted the value of ensuring that public decisions are rooted in quality evidence. Evaluations contribute to all government decisions, from budgets and resource allocation to the impact assessment of new laws and regulations and the design and implementation of long-term strategies. We need capacity to supply the right evidence at the right time and in the right format. Lithuania has created a new data gathering and sharing infrastructure and has demonstrated its ability to commission scientific studies on short notice. However, this report also identifies a number of institutional and organizational gaps that hinder the use of evidence for decision-making. We provide recommendations for strengthening the government's analytical capacity to increase access to evaluations, improve the communication of evidence, and promote policy discussions at the highest political level. Lastly, Strata, the Government Strategic Analysis Center, plays a key role in evidence-informed decision-making and will require full support in its broad mandate and capacity. We understand that Lithuania faces a very specific challenge, that of legislative inflation, which undermines compliance, provides incentives to the informal economy, and creates excessive regulatory burdens. In short, there are too many laws and not sufficient capacity to assess their impact both before adoption and after they have been enacted. Our report addresses this challenge in full and suggests how regulatory management tools can help address it. I am also very pleased that our experts will share with you some of the insights from the latest OECD 2021 regulatory policy outlook. We are happy to see that many of the recommendations that were discussed during this project are likely to be considered by the government in its future plans, whether in the short or medium term. We hope that your success will be one of inspiration for other OECD countries in the future. Madam Prime Minister, Madam Speaker, Mr. Director General, I wish to thank you all once again, because without your invaluable support, this review would not have been possible. You can continue to count on the OECD to support you in the implementation of your public administration reforms. Thank you very much.
Labai dėkojame už.
Thank you indeed for your welcome address. And now I'd like to give the floor to Director General for Structural Reform Support from the European Commission, Mr. Mario Nava.
The Seimas, dear Prime Minister, dear Deputy Secretary General, dear all, good afternoon. It's a great pleasure to join you here today to share views and results about this important work that we did together. As the Deputy Secretary General said, the work between Strata, the Government Strategic Analysis Center, between us, DG Reform, and between the OECD. The idea is exactly to share the long-term strategic view on policy making in Lithuania, including the perspective of evidence-based and forward-looking approaches, such as the foresight analysis and anticipatory governance. Everyone, I guess, will agree that we need a participatory policy process. The difficulty is that we need a participatory process at a dual level, at the so-called horizontal, across all policy areas, and vertical, across different levels of administration. Sustainable public policy calls, indeed, for a systemic long-term approach, where administration pool their resources together and pool their expertise to develop common solutions. Such an approach can bring policy coherence for the implementation of the SDGs, to reduce economic, social, and environmental costs, and to avoid being locked into what are, or what they reveal to be after a while, unsustainable practices. The Prime Minister said it very clear: to ensure sustainable policy making needs a legislative process which is planned with a consolidated strategic planning, implementing through better coordination. The formulation of policy is more equitable and is more effective when it is based on a process, on an open process that frames the process, and on a process that facilitates to define the needs and to co-create the solution, including, of course, participation of the society, including, of course, participation of the youngsters. Complex crises like climate change or COVID-19 present new challenges to everybody, to the bureaucrats, to the politicians, to the policy making in general. And that's why having an holistic capacity and evidence-informed and innovative policies is absolutely needed. The policies are necessary also to anticipate adverse impact that may come. We are in a world where we don't exactly know what will come. We should be able to address structural changes. We should be able to address unexpected changes. That's why systematic consideration of scientific knowledge enables governments and public administration to define and analyze policy challenges from a multiple perspective and simply to do a better job. But in order to do that, what we need is that this is developed and connected at all levels of administration and policy making, and including at the local level, and that an opportunity is given for training in data literacy to policymakers. In this context, the work of Strata is clearly in the spotlight. This is why, through the project implemented, we very much encourage and support actions to further strengthen Strata and to ensure that it has all the necessary tools to keep evolving and discharge the important strategic foresight mandate. The risk of not incorporating strategic foresight has been recently reiterated by the Commission through our report, the report which is called the Commission First Strategic Foresight in Strategic First Foresight. And that report has four main results, which are climate change and other environmental challenges, digital hyperconnectivity and technological informations, pressure on democratic models of government and values, shift in the global order of demography. They are identified as key global trends. Nothing new to us, nothing new to you, but good to have it in the spotlight for the work of our administrations, plural, to work. With the Lithuanian 2050 strategy, you are really in the right spot. 2050 is not far away. Most of us in the room have kids that in 2050 will be younger than we are today. So for them, 2050 is now, is tomorrow, basically. So while this strategy is being prepared, we support very much Lithuania's aim to adopt evidence-based methodology and truly believe that the outputs of our project referenced today have provided valuable tools for that. Of course, the work doesn't stop here. As regards DG reform work, as most of you know, we are currently in the annual phase of assessing requests for technical support received from member states, including from Lithuania. The assessment, as we always have, we are obliged to say, is a competitive process. We receive many more requests than we can satisfy. So the assessment is a competitive process and is based on the quality of the request received. But we are confident that we will continue working with you, and my colleagues, Fivi Arazzi, under the supervision of Daniele Dotto, who is here with me, is in the room with you to discuss that. So with that said, today I really would like to thank you, dear Prime Minister, dear Deputy Speaker of the Seimas, dear Deputy Secretary General, and wish you an excellent conference for today. Thank you very much.
Labai dėkoju.
I thank all those who made their welcome address. And now we are going to the main part of the conference, and we will soon hear the report and recommendations. First of all, I want to address all the participants of this conference, all those who attend it here and those who have joined us online. I invite you to use the Slido platform. You will soon see the connection details on the screens. We want to hear your expectations, so take out your telephones, your cell phones. So this is the Slido program. You can read the QR code. And this is the question for you. What are your expectations from this conference? Those who joined us online are also invited to engage in this practice, and soon we will be able to see your answers. And at the end of the conference, we will assess how much we've managed to meet your expectations. So this is one of the stages when we meet and when we speak about the progress strategy Lithuania 2050. So we can see on the screens, while the results are very few, you're all very welcome and invited to contribute with your expectations, ideas, breakthrough decisions. These are very positive expectations, breakthrough. Ideas, future, these are keywords or buzzwords. So we all want to get involved, get engaged, and contribute to the development of the Lithuanian progress strategy. And we will continue on discussing not only in this conference. Excellent. We will be able to see all your expectations, and we will return to that later on. Thank you very much. And now let us move to the substance of this conference. And I would like to give the floor to the experts from the OECD, Mr. Stefan Jakobsson, Senior Advisor on Public Governance, and also Claire Salama, Policy Analyst for Public Governance. They will present the results of the survey mobilizing evidence at the center of government, strengthening decision-making and policy evaluation for long-term development.
Dear Vice Speaker of Parliament, dear members of Parliament, thank you very much for the opportunity to share with you today the results of this important project that we have conducted over the past 18 months with the Office of the Government and Strata in terms of mobilizing evidence at the center of government. Just show you a little bit the report because we are very proud of all this work, and we also have some highlights that are available both in English and in Lithuanian for everyone to share. And I've seen that there is great interest in the work from the participation in Slido. So what is, sorry, It's not moving. Oh, yeah. What is evidence-informed policymaking? It's a long word, but it basically says that there is on the one hand the work of science, random experiments, scientific data, observational data, and there is the world of politics. We, the people, the values, the voices, the conflicts, and the social media. I'm sure the days of the Prime Minister is full with that. And out of that, you have to somehow do evidence policy making. In Lithuania, like many OECD countries, is facing multiple challenges. The wicked problems, the so-called problems without any solutions, but that you have to tackle every day, otherwise they will kill you. The fake news and the challenges of trust in public institutions. For that, you need to arbitrate and frame a long-term vision and inject it in the policy-making cycle. And for this, at the technical level, you need to have different ways to promote the use of evidence, to invest in skills, to support the uptake of evaluations, to embed the use of evidence in the actual workings of governments, the what so-called routines of governments in terms of preparing new laws and budget decisions. Policymaking requires tools, structures, and methods, and all of that is boring to death. And the problem is that people want to have many new laws and many laws done quickly. And the challenge is that normally, for the policy-making cycle to work well, you need to shape the agenda, you need to do the impact assessment to fit into policy development, you need to work on policy implementation, you need to learn from experience, draw the results, and go to the next stage. The challenge is, are there the right processes and skills in place in Lithuania at the moment for this to work well? Well, as you will expect, the answer is a bit mixed, because this is why the OECD, it's a bit like going to the doctor. That's why we have been called in to share some experience and insight from other countries. Oh, sorry, I should take away my mask. Some insights from other countries. And we have performed an analysis of the regulatory frameworks, done a gap analysis. We have engaged with so many stakeholders here in Vilnius and across the country with the good support of our Strata colleagues. And we have looked at individual skills, organizational structures, as well as institutions, policies, and frameworks. The first diagnosis is pretty easy. This is a challenge of legislative inflations. A few words, there were 5,000 laws passed in Lithuania or discussed in the period 2016-2020. There are about 700 laws discussed in Parliament every year in Lithuania. And why do the Latvians only need 400? And how can the Estonians go away with only 200? Clearly, the policy-making mill is turning too fast, and there is no time for impact assessment for all this discipline if you go so fast. So you have a proliferation of legislation, which is mostly changing existing laws, all this acquis that was translated after the accession to the European Union and the new regime. But there is also something that is familiar to me, which is some form of a legalistic culture, a taste for legal technical detail, with a lack of sufficient forward planning and no systematic revisions of the stock of legislation. You just pile text over text, and then what's the result? You have excessive regulatory burdens, you have opportunities for lack of compliance and for the informal economy. And we think that there is a clear understanding by the current government of this diagnostic. The problem is, how can you fix these challenges? What to do about it? And here we come, we are good OECD experts. They are the tools of regulatory management. That is a discipline of better regulation, and these tools can be used. And they have been applied to some extent in Lithuania, but I would say that this agenda remains work in progress. There has been some progress, but Lithuania is not yet exactly where it should be. There are well-established consultation processes, but they remain rather formal. The requirements for regulatory impact assessment, they exist, but they're often formal and they are not systematic. There is now a process for the higher impact legislation, and that is a good thing, but there is still insufficient or limited capacity in the ministries to conduct such analysis when it is required. There is also fragmented guidelines and a lack of established processes to support implementation. There is very limited support in the ministries, in the strategic planning units, and fragmented responsibilities for quality assurance. There is also a well-established framework for the transposition of EU directives, but it still lacks, there are gaps in coordination and insufficient provisions for protecting against the risk of gold plating, which was mentioned earlier. There is a nascent framework for ex-post evaluation, but there are clauses in laws where you should do evaluation, but doesn't say with what data, with what resources. Evaluation is costly, and to evaluate, you need to use some of the administrative data that are produced by the laws. As long as this discipline is not injected in the process, you will not go anywhere. So the report offers a number of recommendations to set up a government resolution on better regulation to strengthen the management of regulatory impact assessment, to also move forward with very concrete measures in terms of codification, forward planning, which I think is already taken on board at this stage, and also to review the implementation of directives. We also invite Lithuania, like many neighboring countries, whether Sweden or the Czech Republic or Germany, to consider setting up a regulatory oversight board in the medium term and to streamline coordination and develop training. But this can only go so far. This is the discipline of better regulation, but more needs to be done. There is a need to engage with Parliament, and I think this is one of the reasons we are here today, and the report recommends to set up a memorandum of understanding on these issues between the government and the Parliament. And the report also suggests to create political momentum to enhance the quality of regulatory impact assessments for legislative proposals initiated by members of Parliament. You will see some more details on some of these suggestions in the roadmap for policy implementation, for example, the one prepared by Giedrius Gedziuskas today on some of these aspects. We also suggest to set up a strategic task force on the future of the Lithuanian legal framework, which is a good opportunity as part of general thinking on Fit for 2050. You need to reflect on the long-term costs to the economy of the current legal inflation, because every time you do a new law, you see the short-term benefit. You have your name in the news, you have passed a law, and my country, I'm from France, is not immune of this risk. We know all that too well. But once you have done these laws, what will be the long-term effects? And then there's no one on the phone, no one has thought about it. This is where we really have a gap. There is also a need to assess what are the implications of the current legal culture. Should the laws go in every detail? Have the laws to prescribe everything in detail? Or should that not be some form of a prerogative of the executives, that the Parliament frames the big laws, defines the principles, but that some of the details have to be handled by the government machinery? And beyond that, there is something fundamental that needs to be done about the civil service as part of broader civil service reforms, which will require a whole of government effort. I would now like to give the floor to my colleague Claire Sanama, who will walk you through some of these aspects. Claire, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Stefan. As Stefan just mentioned, really setting up a system for evidence-informed decision-making or evidence-informed policy-making without the skills, without the people to do the analysis or to drive the change, is just a series of good intentions. And that's why policy advice, policy analysis, evaluation is part of the core skills for any high-performing civil service. Now, as mentioned by Stefan, these skills do exist to a certain extent in Lithuania in the civil service, but the challenge is that there's no shared understanding of what these skills are. And that means that it makes it quite challenging to have a granular understanding of where are the skills, where are the capacities in the ministries. What we've seen in our analysis is that there are skills in the ministries at the line ministry level, but really there needs to be a critical mass of these skills. And the people who are doing the analysis, who are working on these long-term research projects, need to be protected from the day-to-day of the administration, need to be protected from, urgent requests from the ministers. And that is something that doesn't exist to date. Another issue that Lithuania is encountering, and that many other OECD countries are encountering really, is the issue of the attractivity of the civil service. And that's why Stefan is talking about a wider reform of the civil service. The attractivity doesn't just mean having the right compensation or the salaries. It also means offering perspectives. It means offering careers for these young, brilliant Lithuanian minds who have these quantitative analytical skills. Now, what can the Lithuanian government do about this? And that's going to be my next slide, Stefan. Well, really, there are two main levers to bridge this analytical gap. The first one is to increase the supply of these skills. And that really requires a broader civil service reform, to have a shared understanding of what do we mean when we say skills for policy analysis. It also requires improving the attractivity of the civil service by investing in scholarship programs for evaluation and analysis, for example, or creating a dedicated track for policy analysis in the civil service, like other countries have done, for example, in Ireland, in the UK, in France. The other side of the coin is to make sure that the existing capacities can be developed in a more systematic way. And so that means, first of all, investing in training, making sure that training programs are more systematic and less on an ad hoc basis, as is currently the case in many ministries. It also means having a granular understanding of where these skills are in each ministries, so that they can be grouped together to create this critical mass that I was just mentioning. But of course, skills is just one part of the issue of supplying evidence. The other part of the issue is data. When we think about data for analysis, next slide, Stefan. When we think about data for analysis, we often think about the issue of access to data, making sure that data can be accessible, that is open. And Lithuania has made some considerable recent efforts in the field of open data. But if data is available and it's of poor quality, let's say there are missing data sets, missing data values in data sets, or that series aren't long enough, or if data sets can't be merged and crossed, for example, without having unique identifiers. Well, I mean, data is not going to be able to be harnessed for analysis. And what we see in Lithuania is that there have been considerable efforts in recent years. I mentioned the open data strategy. There was also in 2020 a significant data governance reform. But Lithuania is still very much lagging behind on our OECD data index that looks at availability, but also accessibility and reuse. So the next step for Lithuania is really to develop a clear governance framework for evidence-informed policymaking. And what does that mean concretely? Well, it means that when we are thinking about producing data, we are thinking already, so very early on in the data production cycle, we're thinking already about how this data is going to be used for analysis in the end. Supply is one challenge and demand is the other challenge. Next slide, please. What do we mean when we mean demand? Well, I mean, it's all good and well to have all of this evaluation and analysis available, but if there is a demand and ownership from the highest level, from decision makers, that data isn't going to be used. So change starts from the top when we're talking about evidence-informed policymaking. In many ways, the COVID-19 crisis was a perfect case study for how do you create this demand? How do you create this change, right? Many countries made use of high-frequency data or mobilized their scientific communities to gather advice on how to develop the best public health policies. And that was very much the case in Lithuania. But we can't always rely on external shocks of this nature to create demand. So what we have to do is we have to create a wider culture for EIPM and evidence-informed decision-making. And that starts with making sure that future generations of decision makers have the appropriate skills and understanding to obtain, to use, to commission evidence. It also means harnessing the power of Parliament, making sure that Parliament is a demander of evaluations and evidence, for example, by including evaluation clauses in laws. In many ways, the event that we're having today, for example, in Seimas is a great example of the interest that Parliament can have in evidence. And of course, you know, the strategic governance reform that has been mentioned by Stefan previously is also a great way to make sure that feedback loops are created so that evidence can be used for strategic foresight. But there are also more concrete ways to foster demand for evidence. And that means making sure that the analysis is available and communicated in a way that is really tailored to the end user and understandable. Next slide, Stefan. Thank you. And this is really where we can tap into the power and the role of Strata. So the first step is making sure, of course, that the analysis is available. And a lot of recent efforts have been made in Lithuania in this regard. For example, for the availability and publicity of evaluations of structural funds. But what needs to happen is to have one single place, one single web searchable portal where all of the evaluations and research that is done by government and in government can be accessed in an easy way. And the next step, of course, is making sure that not only is the evidence available, but it's translated, it's disseminated in a way that is tailored to the users, to the decision makers, and is timely. And that's where communication and knowledge brokerage come into play. Some actors like the Supreme Audit Institution, for example, or the Bank of Lithuania have really made efforts to communicate actively the evidence. But there needs to be a more systematic approach to that, maybe by harnessing the power of social media, for example. And this is really where I think that Strata can have a great role to play. Back to you, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Claire. Yes, because Strata needs to be the engine in the system. It clearly has the mandate to be a strategic advisory body, but in this context, you have to balance carefully the various roles of Strata. We want Strata to be able to support foresight, advice and evaluation, ex-post assessment. That requires a lot of brain power, and you have to be careful about loading Strata too much with some of the operational tasks of monitoring progress in the implementation of the government program. So we generally advocate at the OECD for the tasks of monitoring to be really close to power, to be done somewhere within the office of the government, and for Strata to focus more on the longer term. We also think that we need to have a separate analytical civil service track in the Lithuanian civil service in the longer term. That track, Strata will have the responsibility to manage the recruitment, to select the people, and then to give the qualified candidates to the government, and that is for the government to handle and to see where the capacity needs to be injected. But the report also saw some gaps even in the tertiary education system in Lithuania. We're engaged with senior academics. You have some of that in the roadmap provided by Povilas Lastauskas. If some of you want to see it today on Strata's website, there is a need to strengthen master programs in policy analysis and economics on the same way as has been done with other European countries, whether in Germany, in Ireland, or in France. We'll give you some concrete examples. And Strata needs to promote seminars. We saw too many junior analysts in the ministries. They are alone. They don't have opportunities for sharing. There is no series of Venus economic seminars. That's what you need, a simple series where people who work in government can go and present some of the work in progress and share it with colleagues so that they benefit from the collegial approach. Of course, Strata has to provide quality control for high impact regulatory impact assessments, though we also say that the official decision to approve a regulatory assessment should, in the longer term, be given to a regulatory impact assessment board or some form of a review board so that you take away the formal responsibility of Strata in the public domain. But Strata still needs to support the competencies for RIA across government. And the report also has some recommendations to strengthen the governance, organization, and the resources of Strata, which include a mix of core resources and funds, mostly from the European Union projects. For those of you who are interested in this work, you have this report and the highlights are available on the OECD website. We have also done a lot of work in this project in terms of workshops, in terms of also the roadmaps to support the implementation of the results with Giedrius Kadziauskas, who will moderate the roundtable today, Ramunas Vilpizauskas, Eglerim Kuti, and Povilas Lastauskas. All of this information will be available on the Strata's website. So, is Lithuania fit for 2050? Maybe not yet, but it will be soon. So this was a fruitful partnership with many opportunities for knowledge sharing. It shows the value of peer exchange with OECD countries. and also show that to frame a long-term policy agenda, you have to balance investment in the long term with short-term needs and priorities. But the goal is to build trust in evidence as an engine for future-oriented reforms. Thank you so much.
Labai dėkojame gerbėmiems ekspertams.
I thank you, our experts, who provided us with so many insights, so many valuable insights. Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Giedrius Kadzauskas, expert in public administration reform, and he will share his insights on the overview that has been conducted by the OECD. Thank you. Thank you very much. I'd like to focus on one element of this overview and the recommendations of the OECD, and that is the regulatory, more legal inflation. It's like an elephant in the room. We all feel that it exists, but we do not fully know what it is like. For some, this elephant hinders their way forward. This elephant is requires to be taken off. It requires certain costs. Some of us tend to feed this element. And probably the regulatory inflation and the decline in regulatory value is very important and consists of three elements. The first element is the amount and the scope of regulation. We tend to introduce national rules where there is no need for any, or where the rules did not exist previously. The second element is the level of regulation. We undertake to regulate through the laws adopted by the Parliament the things that we can determine at a lower level. Third element is the regulation by means of amendments and a lack of stability. That is when the law on, for example, the law on public procurement is being amended over and over again. And ultimately, no one believes that this amendment is of lasting and real value. The search for that optimal solution is difficult as it requires regulations, changes to it, and we need to correct the mistakes that have been made previously. In Lithuania, there is not enough academic research or deeper reflection on what too fast legislation or legal inflation are. We have a report from the National Audit Office, an article by Mr. Lukošaitis, and a couple of other sources. These studies reveal more of the output side, that is, how much we have produced. We calculate the speed. However, there is little value when it comes to the impact side, as we do not answer what the impact of this too fast production of laws is on the whole system. Well, finally, we think very little about why there is a need to regulate a lot and quickly. Well, there is a Scottish proverb saying that everyone talks about the way I drink, but no one cares why I am that thirsty. So there is always a lack of trust and professionalism. We want to micromanage, micro-govern the processes or events because this is how we expect impact to be made. The second is the regulatory reflex. It's the concept that was used by the Dutch researchers for the first time back in 2015. The reasons of regulatory reflex is the lack of clear and fully fledged communication and dialogue with the public groups. There is a lack of trust among all key players, politicians, implementers, society, businesses, and suddenly, the Parliament wants to regulate the things that do not necessarily need to be regulated. The third element is that almost all institutions are assessed on the basis of the number of legislation it adopts, rather than on the effectiveness and results of the policy. The government plan of measures was essentially a list of laws that the ministries are responsible for drafting. Members of the Seimas are evaluated on the basis of the amendments and proposals they submit. So as long as we do not get rid of such basis for evaluation, we won't change anything. Also, we do regulate a lot. We want to regulate a lot because regulation is very easy. We can agree that there is a need for less and slower regulation, but I believe that it is very comfortable to regulate the things. On the other hand, everyone is extremely willing to regulate. If you are a minister, you believe that the regulation is the best way forward, and it also contributes to your public image. And therefore, it is very difficult for the minister himself or herself to refrain from introducing new legislation. The promise of self-control is difficult both for yourself and for others. The government, together with the ministries, develop a plan to regulate individual policies in time to review the legislation governing them. And they review individual legislation rather than reviewing the entire regulatory area. And for example, the Ministry of Economy and Innovation, let's say, has some 12 regulatory areas and plans to investigate, assess the impact of a certain legislation to be adopted. And then they decide that they, let's say, take 2 of the 12 areas and they will regulate. This would mean that the minister will have to adopt a 6-year plan. The plan has a disciplinary effect, as such plan allows the ministry to correct the plan. This also allows the government to introduce its own priorities, but it would also to bring more clarity in the legislation. Moreover, this will also allow to use the database of the Lithuanian legislation. We have quite a good one because we know which institution and which member of the parliament registered one or another initiative or draft law or draft amendment. But we do not have an analytical appendix. We do not have all the documents in a machine-readable and accessible format. We do not have the demand formulated by the state authorities. The parliament and the government could agree on specific measuring indicators, that is, how many legal acts we have in the legislative framework, how many new legal acts we need to adopt, and the third proposal that was offered under this program was to engage into more talking. 4 years ago, the parliament adopted a law. It had certain intention. It had a vision as to how the certain public policy had to look. And we have to assess whether we have succeeded to achieve the objectives of the law that was adopted. And we have to see whether achieved the end result. But the problem is that the Lithuanian parliament is willing to regulate everything once it hears of the possibility to regulate something. So these are my first reflections and suggestions. I just looked at the watch and I see that my time is running out. So I'd like to invite the honorable panelists for debate, and thank you for your attention.
Tai dėkojame Giedriui.
Thank you, Mr. Kadzauskas, for your insights. He will be moderating the panel discussion. And I'd like to invite Ms. Ingrida Šimonytė, the Prime Minister, Mr. Gintautas Bartkus, Associate Professor of Practice at Vilnius University, Secretary General of the Lithuanian Parliament, Modestas Gelbūda, Senior Advisor from the OECD, Stefan Jakobzone, First Deputy Speaker of the Lithuanian Parliament, Jurgis Razma. We're going to have quite a few panelists. Some of them will join us online. We will have Jurga Gečienė, Deputy Minister of Justice. We will also have Dovydas Vitkauskas, who will join us online, and he's an expert in public administration and reforms and justice. Once we hear the introductions, we will engage in the debate, so we would be very happy to hear the questions. So I hope that you will join the slide platform. You enter the code 2050 and put forward the questions. We will select the most important questions that we would expect our panelists to answer at the end of the debate. Thank you very much. Thank you for coming to the panel discussion. We don't have much time, so I would kindly ask everyone to remember during your introduction of the time limits imposed on us. Mr. Gintautas Bartkus, I have a question to you. On the one hand, you are a consumer, as you are a lawyer and an advocate. What is the theoretical position should be taken by the parliament and by the government in order to come up with some principal position? Thank you indeed for the question. Recently, the Vytautas Magnus University in Kaunas held a conference dedicated to the anniversary of this university, and I like the idea that was expressed in that conference. We compare the number of legislation with inflation. Well, a very good comparison indeed, but I guess that not everyone is aware of what should be done with this inflation. Maybe some inflation is a good thing, but when there is an excess of inflation, it's not a very good thing. To my mind, a comparison would be even better if we compared a number of legislation with climate change. So the excessive legislation is a risk to the legal framework. Just like we see that the climate pollution, CO2 emissions, pose a threat to climate and to the world. So the same could be said about excessive regulation. So the answer could also seem very simple and clear. One very famous governance specialist, expert, said what should be done in order to, one expert said what should be done in order to stop smoking. Solution is very easy, just stop smoking. The same with excessive legislation. What we should do is to stop proliferation of legislation and adopt more quality legislation. In physics, we have the concept of permeability. So the same could be applied in the Lithuanian parliament. How much is Seimas capable of producing legal acts? As I calculated a standard working time of a member of the Seimas, because I had to presume how much time he has for reading the legal text, how much time he needs to look at one page of one law. It would take from 30 to 50 legal acts for a member of the parliament. Today, this figure amounts to 130 to 150. So what we should try is to have a political agreement on what our capacity in the parliament is. And when it comes to our civil code, in 2018 we adopted a new civil code and we had a political agreement not to change the civil code. This political agreement stayed in place for 5 years. Unfortunately, after that, we broke the agreement and we had the proliferation of amendments to the civil code. So, but this example alone shows that we are capable of reaching an agreement. So I believe that the same could be done when it comes to legal acts in the Seimas. I see that I have run out of time, but still I believe that what we should do is to reduce the proliferation of legislation. Thank you. When you talked about permeability, we do pay attention to that. This seems like a normal category to us. But when it comes to the parliament, we do not apply the concept of permeability to the production of laws. Well, I talked only the side that is related to quantity rather than quantity. So if we take some articles by various experts and professors on the production of legislation during various financial crises, I took account of one recommendation. Today, it is very important to think of not what it has to be regulated, but how it should be regulated. We have to spend time on the ways we choose for regulation. We can talk about the soft law, we can talk about the classical laws, or we can talk about some modern things, but the recommendation is to stop and think of what should be regulated, but how everything should be regulated. Thank you. Mr. Dovydas Vitkauskas, you as an external expert, do you have any advice how to stop and to think what should be regulated and to regulate less? Thank you. Giedrius, can you hear me? Well, indeed, a very interesting debate. May I thank you, all the keynote speakers. Well, I've been both a consumer and user of legislation, and I'm very happy to hear the concept of legal inflation, because I've been using this term for many years now. Our community already discuss about legal inflation, at least at conceptual level. But of course, much still needs to be done. We have to work with our politicians. We have to make sure that we understand what legal inflation is, that we have no such thing as legal inflation. Well, Giedrius convinced me not to show one slide for me. That slide featured a picture where legislators have to think about the society as about the room, and the laws as about the furniture, because furniture can be comfortable. Furniture does not have to be clumsy. Furniture does not have to be expensive, and vice versa. Furniture can be clumsy and very expensive and very elaborate and sophisticated, but not useful at all. In this respect, regulation is very similar to a room and furniture, because we have to regulate, to navigate and to develop, create the laws for society that are easy to navigate. The best analogy for this is the IKEA company, as the IKEA is well aware of how to construct effective and comfortable and cozy furniture. our regulators, not only in Lithuania, but also at the EU level, as well as in our neighboring countries, are not always aware of this principle. Less is more is the principle that should be transposed into the regulation area. Mathematicians might not agree, but I believe that 1 + 1 is 0. I know mathematicians are against this, but as I come from the social background, social education background, I believe that in real life, the equation 1 + 1 is 0, very often a justified equation. This does not mean that if we adopt more laws on taxation, we will collect more taxes. Those who deal with human resources know that it is not enough to have two talented staff workers. Sometimes their interaction might lead to a failure. Sometimes many laws will not result in efficient practical implementation of those laws. Both in Lithuania and at the EU level, we too highly emphasize on prohibitions because we believe that prohibitions will stimulate people to act according to the rules, and that the state will act according to the rules that it adopts. So the principle of the stick and carrot should be applied more often in a wide variety of areas. So there should be many things that we should think about. The principle that what is not forbidden is allowed is very popular, and many legal theorists might argue that in public administration and in public law, this principle is not applicable. I would disagree. If we give our authorities clear instructions, I believe that we will succeed. I have the regulators and the oversight institutions at the state level. If we give the instructions and we give the mandate to those authorities to act on their discretion, will be very good for the public administration. We need key performance indicators that could be easily assessed. We need to encourage discretion, because currently discretion is not encouraged in many cases. And if we want to bring good leaders, we need to give them more freedom of discretion. When it comes to impact assessment, I think that when it comes to harm reduction in the context of Lithuania, in public domain, we talk about very abstract values as to how we should safeguard our society from the damage. But we have to think more broadly. Well, I do agree that the acts of businesses might bring certain damage to society, but we should think at each different levels of the damage, maybe the damage to stakeholders, businesses, environment. Other damage that might be brought by businesses are very minimal. So we should clarify what damage we have in mind rather than talking about damage in general. When it comes to businesses, we have to take into account the fact that businesses pay for everything because they pay taxes. They are accountable to the state. Therefore, when the state introduces certain legislation, the regulators have to clearly speak about the damage. I managed to interfere, Dovydas Vitkauskas. Just one sentence. Mr. Vitkauskas, you have one more sentence to say. Well, be economical when it comes to regulation. And this means that we will have more rules that are practical and effective. Thank you very much. I know that I won't be able to stop the Prime Minister. So, Madam Prime Minister, I have a question to you. You have heard hundreds of recommendations. In your hands, you have the resources and the time. What do you think this government can do, and what it can well, it will not be that difficult to stop me from speaking because I see the watch in front of me. So the government has already been doing a lot. The principle that was mentioned, less is more, is the principle that has been declared by the government from the very start of its term. During the spring session, opposition was very unhappy about the fact that hundreds of draft amendments and draft laws were not registered for the spring session. So we apologized, the opposition, and said that we were not going to bring all those hundreds of amendments on the table. So the flow of legislation that we have proposed this year was reduced by half. Well, I should be proud of that, but when there is vacuum, this vacuum is filled by various initiatives of members of the Seimas. So the problem is not only the legal one, but it's also a political problem. You have also mentioned that members of the Seimas and the work of the Seimas are assessed by the number of draft laws they legislate. It doesn't matter how many, what will happen to this draft law. 90% of initiatives, of legislative initiatives by members of the Seimas do not go further than the presentation stage, which means that nothing happens to the legislative proposals that are provided by members of the Seimas. So the reforms and the legislation that are proposed by the government are on the political agenda of the government of the Republic of Lithuania. But also there's the parliamentary oversight. As the former chair of the Committee on Audit of the Seimas of the Republic of Lithuania, I am very well aware of the example of the amendments that were submitted to the law on public procurement. I was rather comfortable with the fact what the Committee on Audit was engaged with, because we used to have a lot of material, we used to have a lot of insights provided by the Lithuanian National Audit Institution. We looked at the performance assessment. We received a lot of food for thought. We were able to work, but as I was very diligent in reading all those legislative initiatives, I can say that it was almost impossible to look at all of them. But the problem is also that majority of legal professionals say that the problem is not in the legal inflation. The problem is in the implementation of laws. I think that everyone in the parliament believes that once there is a problem, the solution to the problem is amendment to the law. So I think that this is a kind of a reflex. And that is why we always fail to clarify who and what is responsible for doing what. Because we tend to amend our law on public procurement every 2 to 3 years. So I'll stop at that.
Aš, gerbiamas Jurgi,
Thank you. Now, Deputy Speaker of the Parliament, Mr. Asma. Well, actually, the Parliament is criticized for too high activity of members of Parliament, and you see the situation. What do you think? Is there any hope for the future? Or maybe the Constitution should be amended in order to limit the free powers of members of Parliament in today's context. Hello. Well, I don't agree with your proposals on the constitutional amendments. Now, speaking about the future, I would be carefully optimistic. You speak about legislative inflation, but if you look at this, at the figures of this term, legislative term, actually we're experiencing a deflation. I have statistical data. There's been a 20% of decrease in legislation during the previous session of the Parliament. Well, there are some minor details that we don't adopt the law on the change of the working program of the session. The committees have heard our proposal to merge certain draft laws for adoption, and we actually have plans to reduce this flow of legislation. If the ministries were authorized to merge some draft legislation into a more general ones, for example, now if we amend an energy law on energy, we have to change other laws that are related. If we had, for example, one energy code, it would be easier. We could have a general law on legal entities with associations and many other entities. If we reduce the amount of effective laws, this would also influence future legislative initiatives. Speaking about members of Parliament and their proposals on draft legislation, I think that the society can contribute to that. I think that there could be a critical article on members of Parliament who contribute a lot to legislative legislation, and please praise those members of Parliament that do not propose a lot of draft legal acts, but give lots of proposals on the existing drafts. Well, the same as the Parliament is often criticized, but I want to praise it. I think that this is one of the open and transparent parliaments in the European Union. We have video webcasts where all proposals are included in the Commission conclusions. In this area, we perform quite well, and our legal quality is quite good. Well, I could say that we could decide that when, for example, there is a certain legislative amendment, similar legislative amendments could not be registered by members of Parliament, only the proposals on the existing legislative amendment that has been tabled in order to reduce the inflation. Thank you, Deputy Speaker. Now, Modestas, I would like to ask you. I think that you are responsible for a part of this work of the Parliament. I have in mind openness. How can the Parliament reduce the amount of legislation through organizing its work? Thank you very much for your invitation and the possibility to attend this discussion. I'm a representative of the business area and business management, and it is a great opportunity to join the public sector. Well, speaking about legislative inflation, it is dangerous actually. We know that when we speak in financial terms, money loses its value. So the same is with the legislation. Legislation depreciates as well as money. I have another term which is related to the activity of the office of the Parliament. During the first week or two, I've noticed the weeds of legislation. What does it mean? Not the seeds that we want to see. Well, valuable legislation promotes a certain correct behavior, and weeds is something which is against the common sense, which enables the society or the public to act and result in further legislation. Well, the first steps that we have taken in the Parliament for you to understand our direction. Data and facts are very important for me, and luckily the government and the office of the government is speaking about that. I asked the Department of Law, how many conclusions, legal conclusions you make? And they say 1,500 a year. This is a large number. So I asked the legal department what they do when they asked to make a conclusion. And they said that 3 or 7 related legal acts need to be reviewed when preparing a legislative conclusion. And I asked them about some senseless factors, some illogical things, and they said that every 10th law has some illogicalities. And then I asked them, what do you do when you notice that? And they say that, well, it is difficult to change that. And this is actually removing the weeds of legislation. So the staff of the office of the Parliament can identify some improvements that are cost effective. And we've agreed on having a form and database for all the weeds and removing of all those weeds. And I want to briefly say that there are 3 main things to improve legislation in general. Selection is something which is very important. When we have limited resources, we need to have a strict selection. Factor number 2 is a process and involvement of all the parties. I'll give you a brief example. If we have a correct process in management, businesses have 80% of success in the introduction of new products, and I also hope that 80% of our introduced laws become effective. Thank you very much, Modestas. And now I'd like to give the floor to Jurga Reichienė, Deputy Minister of Justice. Could you share, alongside with all those experts that have spoken, what is the role of the Ministry of Justice and what you can do and what you are going to do? Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for the opportunity to join you here. Unfortunately, I was not able to attend in person. Many things have already been mentioned, and I'm very glad that the topic of today's conference offers change that should emerge in the heads of every person. And we should not speak about legislative initiatives based on evidence. Well, legislative initiatives should be based on evidence, but any talks or discussions on change should start from evidence and should be based on evidence. Very often we see that when we have a problem, we see a legislative proposal. First of all, the problem should be addressed in terms of whether it should be regulated or not and what should be regulated. And as the former minister said, we should then speak about how to regulate. And this is related to the stability of our civil code, which haven't been amended for 5 years. So this is a good example that changing rules could be implemented in other ways, not only by laws. Speaking about our ministry and its role in the legislative cycle, agreement is very important to my mind. I have in mind agreement on the governmental level, and the Ministry of Justice could be an advisor to the government whether we still honor this agreement. We need to agree on what legislative processes we need, what we expect from them. The process brings us to good or bad results. And all the parts and elements of these processes. Very often, experts note that having necessary competences for policy makers is important. If we have an agreement and if we plan the cycle and involve people who have necessary skills and competences for that, discipline is equally important. Sometimes we see it in a negative light, but discipline could help us to stop the mill of legislation when certain prerequisites have to be met in order to move the process forward with the legislation. So the REAs have also to be prerequisites as well as some other elements for the introduction of the process. Even if we have certain emergency situations, we should not think that we have to introduce new legislation to regulate. I hope that we will be able to agree on our breaks, on ways to stop legislative inflation and to find the best way to have less, which is more. Thank you, Jurga. You managed the time and you gave some food for thought. You spoke about agreement. It's not the law that enables the government to propose a certain amount of laws. Your example of the civil code was a very good example. The labor code is also a common agreement that we have to wait a certain period of time for the law to be enacted to see its effect on the long-term perspective. We need to undertake certain rules of the game. And the last participant of our discussion is Mr. Stefan Jakobsson.
Our top-tier politicians reflecting on what you have suggested. Please tell us what you think and how other OECD countries with their experiences could help us.
Thank you very much. Thank you, distinguished guests, prime ministers. First, I will say law has to be a living instrument. So it's good to hear that the Lithuanian democracy is up and alive. Laws have to be adapted because they are a fact of the life of the people. However, I also get concerned when I hear, well, we have already made progress, we have already reduced by somewhat the flow of legislation, so we'll be okay. No, what you need is to implement structural change. Not just change for 6 months or for 1 year, change over the course of this legislature and beyond as well. And I will say as well, the fact is that the good thing about your disease, it's a disease that is very common. So you have many other countries who have tried remedies and medicine for this disease. The first tool, not very new, is this codification tool, and I've heard good initiatives on the codes. The only thing I would point is that some countries are doing codification at not legal constant scale. That means you codify and simplify at the same time. That has happened in France or Italy. The parliament gives habilitation to the government to prepare a new code whereby the governments will put together the laws but simplify the margin. It's not substantive amendments, but just to make it more practical. And I understand that at the moment the legal features of Lithuania do not allow for doing that. And that would be a very useful thing to introduce. The second thing I would say is that that is allowed, presented, I think, in your roadmap document, Giedrius, is these fitness checks. That's what the European Union does. That is a periodic review of the stock of regulation, domain by domain, every 4 or 5 years. And once you start this process, it will take time, but after 10, 15 years, you would have a much better situation. Then another thing I would like to say is that I'm French, and that's not in the OECD report because it's a bit more specific. But in my own country, in the 1950s, we had terrible legal inflation. And in fact, there was a very important feature that was introduced in the French Constitution in 1958. And I've done a lot of regulatory reform work with Italy. And I realized that Italy has not introduced such features. And the feature is very simple. It defines in limited terms what is in the domain of the law. That means the parliament has to define the big areas, the big decisions, but the rest is a prerogative of the government. That means that if you do too detailed laws in parliaments, the government, anything that is a domain of regulation, the government can change. When I hear, Mrs. Prime Minister, that the parliament is doing laws on changing rules for public procurement, I'm wondering, is that the business of parliamentarians? Should not that be the work of the government to do these technical rules? But if by the Constitution the government had the right to change all of that, it would change the term of the equation. Of course, it's a significant change. It's not something that can be implemented easily, but I wanted to mention it. And the last easy point is when you have too much water, you just have to turn the tap. That means you have to look at the agenda of the parliament and maybe think about how this agenda between initiatives of individual parliamentarians versus initiatives of the government. For example, you could say that for time to be devoted in parliament, you have for initiatives to be supported by, I don't know, 30%, a third or 2/3 of the parliamentarians. Otherwise, you're just wasting your time. Or you would want to, parliamentarians are assessed by their numbers of legal initiatives. You want to have a good Michelin guide, that is, how many of these initiatives are supported by an impact assessment and how many are not. Very simple things. You look at the tap and you look at the quality of the water that comes in the tap. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stefan. Aš noriu padėkoti visiems diskusijos dalyviams ir
I want to thank all the participants of the discussion, but we still have to hear one question through the Slido platform. I thank the participants. Well, we chose 2 questions. One will be brief and another will be more extensive. How to ensure the responsibility of decision makers that all the quality requirements are observed? And another question, could you forecast what is the percentage of the OECD recommendations to be put in practice? I will ask Mr. Deputy Speaker to answer the first question, and the Prime Minister could answer the second question. I will try to answer both questions, if I may. Well, speaking about the first question, while responsibility could be ensured by reducing the amount, if you look at the number of legal drafts that are not seen as having no negative effects, so then we can ask a question, why do we need this law if it has no impact on anybody? So we have to reduce the mill. And the smaller this mill is, the more time we could have for better explanatory notes. As Mr. Gintautas mentioned, this is not less important than the law. And then data provision and all the information which is needed could be implemented. And good planning is also a very positive thing that the government is trying to do. I don't agree with the critics that I've heard. Well, for the entire legislative term, we've planned the reduction of legislative initiatives, and all the major legislative initiatives have to be evaluated in a more extensive way. On speaking about the OECD recommendations, I understand those recommendations, which is related to civil service, competence, skills, and the principle, which, well, we have the lack of or the trust deficit. One of my previous bosses used to say, well, the laws are made for criminals, and I don't agree with that. This understanding actually makes our legislation process so clumsy. Therefore, we have to go back to soft law, to enabling, not to have the presumption that everybody is a criminal or a crook. You should not address the problem just because you think that it needs to be addressed. I think that is related to the cultural problems that we will try to address. And the government will try to do as much as possible concerning other technical recommendations of the OECD. Thank you. Now, speaking about the responsibility, it's not so simple. You can say that legislative drafts are registered by politicians elected by the people, and they are responsible before their voters if the voters follow the work of members of parliament. But if we blame the initiator might say that, well, the law was voted on by all the parliament in the end, and this is not my own responsibility. But what can be done? We can establish the requirement to publish the forecast. For example, the government presented new principles on polluting vehicles. And the minister then has to guarantee that in, say, a few years, the number of polluting vehicles will be reduced. And then the politician could be held responsible for his forecast coming into reality. But this is also associated with our civic society, its activity, with social media, with the media. And I think the statute of the parliament cannot make a huge change here. And I think that Modestas and Dovydas would like to say a few words. The speaker has not turned on the microphone. The microphone of the speaker is turned off. It is important to show the problem which is addressed by a legislative initiative. Sometimes there's a lack of understanding of what regulation drives at. Therefore, we have to have a problem and then the anticipated result or effect of the legislative initiative. Then the evaluation of the effectiveness of the law can be measured. And this would be a good disciplinary measure. Well, there's a paradox. There are so many conclusions that you've mentioned. They speak about compliance with the rest of the legislation, but we don't speak about the compliance with the legislative procedure, with the legislative process, whether ex post or ex ante evaluations were made or RIAs were made. And we need to see a certain legislative draft and its compliance with the process, whether it is evidence-based or whether it was evaluated. And another aspect is that responsibility. What type of responsibility? Information. First of all, the more we know about the initiator, about the adoption of the law, about those who voted for the law or legal amendments, we as voters can make a lot of conclusions, and this is a very powerful instrument. And let us not think about a certain responsibility, criminal responsibility. The existence of information is very important. Thank you. I thank all the participants of the discussion. While we leave this rostrum, we will have another presenter. Please give a round of applause to the moderator and participants of the discussion. I would like to make a conclusion and to make the closure of the conference to Mr. Darius Žeruolis, advisor to the Prime Minister.
Thank you. I will leave no intrigue because I know what I risk when I talk about such things. So I have two ideas in mind. First and foremost, I'd like to express my gratitude to the OECD colleagues for the work that it has undertaken, for the overview, for the cooperation that we have been engaged in. And I believe that I also contributed to this process, to the overview itself, because it was me who requested the assessment of the governance in Lithuania. As far as I understand, the OECD has given us with a lot of recommendations. The government will have to look at those recommendations. The Prime Minister and I will engage into the debate. We've heard of a lot of proposals. We've heard of the problems that we face. So I will not specify them, but I believe that we are willing to work forward with the recommendations. Once again, thank you, the OECD experts. And I'm grateful to Mr. Kadzauskas for his input into the process. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Žeruolis. And we have a 15-minute break. So I invite everyone to interact with each other, those who are present here in the hall, and I invite everyone to come back to the meeting at 3:05.
Sveiki sugrįžę, kviečiam
Welcome back. Please take your seats, and I would kindly ask you to take every second seat so that we can maintain social distancing. I also welcome back those who have joined us online. Now we'll begin with a second session of the conference, and on the we're going to speak about the future, about the regulatory trends, and about the Lithuania's strategy, Lithuania 2050. And once again, we would kindly ask the audience to contribute to the conference through your answers in the Slido platform. So the question for you is whether you are aware of the foresight methods. So we kindly ask you to vote when it comes to this question. How many of you are aware of the foresight methods? Please be open, tell the truth, because this will be an indication that there is a need for more education on foresight. We see the changes in the answers, but I'm very happy to see that absolute majority of the participants of the conference are aware of what foresight is. So we will have the results for ourselves. We will prepare the future plans by taking into account your answers. Now we'll move on to the content of the event. You already see our guests of the conference. We have OECD experts who have joined us online. I'd like to give the floor to Daniel Trinka, Deputy Head Division, Regulatory Policy Division, and Piret Tonuris, Policy Analyst of the Observatory on Public Sector Innovation. They are going to speak about the OECD changes when it comes to regulatory trends. So you have the 15 minutes, dear guests.
Thank you very much, and good afternoon, everyone. If you allow me, I will start with my part of the presentation, which talks about regulatory policy and its future. I will try to share my screen with you. Hope you can all see it. My name is Daniel Trinka. I'm the Deputy Head of the Regulatory Policy Division in the OECD, where we're serving as a secretariat also to the OECD Regulatory Policy Committee. And in our committee and in our division, we take 2012 OECD recommendation on regulatory policy and governance as a sort of a fundamental basis for our work. However, we have already started thinking about regulatory policy 2.0. And to be honest, we started thinking about this concept even before the COVID pandemic. However, this now has become even more important and more pressing. Why is that? Well, as you can see in our indicators of regulatory quality, basically all OECD countries have established some kind of regulatory policy and have elements of regulatory policy and have policies about using regulatory management tools such as regulatory impact assessment, stakeholder engagement, and to a certain extent also ex-post reviews. But also, most of these tools exist on paper, de jure, but their implementation is uneven, to say the least. They really need better implementation. They really need mainstreaming. In many cases, regulatory impact assessment takes place late in the process to justify decisions that have already been made. Stakeholder engagement also takes place very late in the process, at the stage where a legislative draft is ready and the willingness to change it substantively is very limited. And also ex-post reviews are not yet implemented in many of the OECD countries. Yet during the COVID-19 crisis, regulation and regulatory policy plays a very important role. We keep talking about vaccines, masks, lockdowns. However, behind almost all of these measures, there are laws and regulations. And these laws and regulations, when adopted, needs to respect certain procedures. Of course, during the pandemic, there is not enough time to go through a full-fledged regulatory impact assessment or stakeholder engagement. However, many of these measures still needed some cooperation with stakeholders, whether these were scientists, representatives of businesses, etc. And also some kind of thinking about alternative options and about costs and benefits of those. Still, many of these regulations were adopted in haste and therefore need to be evaluated, exposed when the crisis is over, and we all cross our fingers that this will be soon. We need to come back to those measures and see whether they work and to what extent and why. Also, what become even more important is the phase of regulatory delivery. How regulations are being implemented, how they are enforced, how compliance is ensured. All those measures about wearing masks, for example, wouldn't make any sense if they were not explained properly to the public, what is their purpose, and if they were not enforced by certain institutions so they could deliver the desired effects. And connected to this is the issue of risk management and assessment. I mean, we have learned painfully that not all risks can be actually avoided, and we need to think about how to manage those risks, how to assess those risks, and how to actually not just measure costs and benefits, but also how to take risks as part of the formula and base our decisions on risk prevention as well. And last but not least, regulatory policy will play an important role in the recovery process. We will need definitely to reduce unnecessary regulatory burdens for businesses to bring them back to full speed. But at the same time, we will also think about how to better protect our citizens, the environment. And for this, we will need more regulations, as has already been mentioned. So is there a need for a regulatory reboot? We believe there is. Still, regulatory policy needs to be better mainstream in the decision-making process of the government. That means when achieving climate goals, for example, all these measures need to be based on evidence and need to be consulted with stakeholders. This is where regulatory policy kicks in. And sometimes we hear governments talking about SDG goals and regulatory policy in parallel, but the connection is still not made. Also, technologies are evolving really rapidly, and we need more agile and resilient regulatory practices, and I will talk about it in a second. We need to improve stakeholder engagement. It's not enough to put our draft laws online at a very late stage and expect that not many stakeholders will send us their comments. It's really important to engage with stakeholders already in the process of developing laws and regulations from the very beginning. We need to better coordinate internationally. As someone said, and it's the title of one of our publications, no regulator is an island, no regulator works in its isolated manner. Technologies, environment do not respect borders, and therefore it is really crucial that regulators and administrations cooperate when regulating. And last but not least, we need to modernize and humanize regulatory reviews. That means we need to take into account the environmental and social aspects, look at the impacts on specific groups, disadvantaged groups, for example, or small and medium enterprises for that matter. Let me stop here talking about the future for a while, and let's look at the present, the results of the indicators of regulatory quality. For three main indicators, when it comes to stakeholder engagement, we see that Lithuania scores somewhere in the middle, above the OECD average, but there is still room for improvement. When it comes to regulatory impact assessment, Lithuania does quite well, especially when it comes to the de jure situation that is captured by those indicators. Again, the implementation, there are some issues, as it was mentioned some time ago by my colleague Stefan Jacobson. And when it comes to the exposed evaluation of laws, then there are gaps in most of the OECD countries, and Lithuania is no exception. So there is still a lot to be improved. I realize I'm running out of time, so I will just quickly mention our latest output when it comes to the future of regulation. The the recommendation on agile regulatory governance to harness innovation, key objective of which is to provide guidance to help governments to rethink their approach to regulating, to realize the benefits of innovation, so not to prevent innovation while still protecting the health and the safety of our citizens. It has four main pillars: adapting regulatory management tools, which I have already mentioned, fostering international regulatory cooperation, developing more agile and future-proof regulations, meaning making more outcome-based regulations, less prescriptive, to not to be afraid to experiment, and also to adopt enforcement to the new normal, which takes me to my last slide, which speaks about data-driven regulation. So we don't want to look only at how to regulate technologies, but also how to use technologies when regulating. And data is a big part of this. So how to use big data and digital technologies in regulating, in using data and artificial intelligence to improve the design of regulations and their evaluation, but also how to use data, real-time data, for example, from the Internet of Things, to improve regulatory delivery. But this was very quickly, in 8 minutes, a run through to what is described in much more detail in our regulatory policy Outlook 2021 that was published a few weeks ago. You can find it on this email address, and I will stop here and thank you very much. I would be happy to answer any questions you might have. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Daniel. And I'll take it over from here to talk a little bit about also the other angle of the implementation. So how to actually future-proof not only our regulations, but also how to implement in an anticipatory and innovative way where you can have a connection to both regulation and also the outcomes. So the latest coming from the practice of the OECD. So my name is Piret Tenorist. I'm a senior project manager on the issues of anticipatory innovation, governance, and system thinking at the OECD. And today I'm going to talk about the innovative component or the implementation component of what was discussed at the moment as well. Governments around OECD countries have various aims for innovative approaches to reach goals or missions, enhance the public sector, adapt to changes, but also to anticipate unforeseen effects, deal with uncertainty and risk. And there, of course, due to these practices, as mentioned by Daniel as well, returns on investment in terms of practices is more clear than others when we're talking about really uncertain areas, and of course, these kind of uncertain risks that we've seen unfolding in the COVID pandemic as well. And what we really want to do is to move from a reactive government position, kind of wait and see those risks and uncertainties play out and then react, kind of end of the pipe solutions. We actually want to build governance mechanisms that are proactive in nature. So we actually engage with those uncertainties and risks in advance and think about maybe not only our readiness, but the opportunities that these technological developments or innovations actually give us. So both the negative and the positive side of certain futures. And of course, where do our understanding of risks and uncertainties come from? We actually need capacity and strategic foresight to have those risks that are coming up in our papers, in our understanding as well. So it's an ongoing ability to actually perceive, make sense, and act on different perspectives of the future as well. So risk assessment frameworks that are actually robust and are used in governments apply strategic foresight in terms of collective intelligence in participatory, inclusive, and impactful ways. So there are actually ways to create evidence about uncertainty and collect those signals and make sense of it in reality as well. This, of course, in strategic foresight is used in also putting it into national orientations. Like we had the 2050 plan in Lithuania, in terms of sharing visions and success about what we want to achieve, identifying changes, but also using it as a stress test measure in terms of disruptions, megatrend scenarios of different kind that you could use in a regulatory or policy-making process. And that helps us to respond to change early and not fall behind in terms of those challenges. And when we're talking about using futures and foresight perspectives for this, we really mean about acting on it today. not about making a big plan that it doesn't influence our actions. So anticipation in reality is, for example, that we have a forecast, which is also a measure of foresight, that tomorrow there is a 60% chance of rain in Paris, and am I going to actually take an umbrella or not? So anticipation and anticipatory innovation is the choice or the decision that is made on uncertain information, made on what we think might happen, but might not happen in practice. So we're actually making choices today for a future fit situation. And better anticipation actually creates better governance. And what we see is really the impact gap at the OECD when we talk about anticipatory governance and also using agile regulation is to use those future-oriented and transformative ideas and opportunities that come from futures and foresight perspectives in policy action and planning, in strategies, in regulation as well, in terms of the anticipated effect that they may have. And for that, you actually need capacity and agency to make it work. So tools and methods, institutional structures, for example, in parliaments with the countries that we work with together with, they have in many countries from Finland to also Estonia, Iceland, and others have built their own futures committees to actually engage in these future-oriented approaches. Alternative exploration, experimentation, modes and methods. So does your regulation, for example, actually allow for experimentation to happen in policy making, but also as part of regulation itself? And you also have to have an authorizing environment in terms of evidence and evaluation and learning loops and legitimacy around the thinking that you actually do in practice. So what does it look like in practice? So we are actually testing out different ways and methods to build a full model of anticipatory innovation governance in Finland. We're also testing different ecosystem approaches, technology ecosystem approaches in Latvia. We are applying strategic foresight methods to also prototyping approach in Slovenia for the future of the public sector itself, and also building a capacity build program across the public service in Ireland for actually build those capacities across different levels of government. And Juha will speak shortly about what we have learned in Finland, but you can also have additional information here that there are many substantive policy challenges that need anticipation. There are also governance challenges that also kind of hinder the use of anticipatory innovation, from individuals to organizational challenges, procedural issues, and also many of these challenges are connected to actual implementation. So not coming up with a future-oriented plan, but actually using it in practice. And some of the issues of user centricity, data interoperability, all feature into it. So from futures and foresight, the different roles and institutions put into place, from public interest and participation and openness, and having a deliberative process about not very closed and different views into the process itself, having a budget and resource allocation that allows to actually do agile experimentation, but also look at problems in a future-oriented way, and also looking into the role of policy cycles and continuity of reforms, because we live in democracies, and do we actually get to look at long-term issues in a proactive way in practice? So if you're interested in more of our work and the building of the institutions around this that we do, and also the foresight and futures exercising and capabilities we develop, many publications that you will have access to and could look into the work in future to come. So thank you so much for this quick overview about the future governance structures that we're trying to put in place at the OECD, and hope to also collaborate further with Lithuania on the topic. Thank you.
Labai dėkojame EBPO.
I thank you, the OECD experts, and we'll move on with the keynote presentations, and we'll listen to the example from Finland. I'm therefore happy to announce the Director General of the Public Governance Department of the Ministry of Finance, Mr. Juha Saarhio. going to share the Finnish experience, and he's going to speak about promoting anticipatory innovation across government in Finland. We do ask you to observe the time limit.
Thank you. Thank you very much, and good afternoon from Helsinki to Vilnius. I try to share my screen. Hopefully you can see it very quickly. If this doesn't work, let me know if you can see that. Thank you very much. I would like to congratulate you that the launch of report on strengthening decision making and the policy evaluation for the long-term development in Lithuania. It's a very important theme for you and for us too. Now, the next slide. In international comparisons, the public governance in Finland is doing relatively well. When it comes to the innovation and anticipation or foresight, we have in many regards been a country of successful development work and practices. But let me assure you that we definitely are not on the goal yet. It's a long way forward. And honestly said, one of our core weaknesses is that the innovation and anticipation are fragmented and not fully integrated into our steering system. I will touch upon both of the successes and challenges we have, and how we are at the moment trying to make our system more proactive and trying to link the different parts of our system better to each other.
Excuse me, I'm really sorry, we don't see your slides.
Okay.
Maybe ask to share screen, try to do it again.
Let's try again. I try again. I try sharing screen. Sorry for that. I try again. Sorry for this. I don't see why this is not working. Moment. Let's try again.
But we already see. Yeah, then.
I have the screen sharing has stopped and Windows closed. Sorry for that. I try again. Let's try again. Sorry for this mess again. I try to share my screen again.
We apologize the participants for the technical mishaps.
Not see my screen. Try again. Can you see it now?
No, not yet.
Nothing. Funny.
If it's important and if you can't share a screen, you can just continue without it, or you can send.
I can continue just speaking to you because it's so scarce time that we can do that.
Okay, thank you.
I'm very sorry that this screen sharing doesn't work. I don't know. I see it working in here, but there's something troubles online. But honestly said, like I said, the steering system is not ready, even though the government's program says that we should be the best public administration in the world. What do we do at the moment in the field of future and foresight work in Finland? We have the On this area, we have been traditionally a forerunner, and we have our foresight of future work for decades. We have the parliament, in the parliament we have the permanent committee for the future, and we have also the government's future report to parliament equally for long. And in addition, future reviews of the ministries that are done in every 4th year before the election have already existed almost 20 years. And this is the idea is take the civil servants to those questions and challenges of the future, so that the coming government would need to address during the next governmental period. So it means that we don't give the solution, we give the most burning challenges for the coming elections. The most recent addition to the future work we have done here is the future dialogues that were organized by Prime Minister's office all around the country for the citizens. These dialogues were linked to the future report work. And there's also a lot of things going on here. Our current aim is to use all that foresight and future work much better throughout the policy cycle, from voice to strategies, decisions, the implementation and the evaluation. This is why there is an ongoing work with the Commission and the OECD on the field of anticipatory innovation governance in Finland. The OECD had given 7 findings on its latest report, what should we do in Finland. The first one is that innovations has long traditions and enthusiastic support in Finland, public administration, which is a plus, but it's not 100% compatible already with the bread and butter of the ministries, because the link between the programs and the practical implementation and the feedback mechanism are sometimes inadequate. And the ministries might think that the innovation belongs to state agencies. And of course, the lack of centralized development unit makes it harder to combine the foresight and innovation in practical level. And there is no centralized funding either, or the other support function for the public sector innovation activities as such as a basic idea. And the actual work has been outsourced for many times for the consultant agency, and this will raise the question, does the public sector gain enough tacit knowledge from the projects? Then a few words how to promote the anticipatory innovation across the government in Finland. Of course, the public interest and the participation is the key word. The futures and foresights should be done with the citizens all around the world, combined with the civil servant and the politicians. And the budget resources and allocation should be done based on the anticipatory innovation work. And of course, we should speed up the capacities and skills and factors what are crucial to anticipatory innovation work inside the public administration, the politicians, and between the politicians and the leading civil servants. And we must ensure that the policy cycles and will go over the governmental periods, and the continuity of the reforms will go on also over the election, so to say, over the election and for the new government as well. And of course, we have to strengthen the coordination across the government challenges. In practice, what has been done lately, we have 4 piloting cases. The first piloting cases based on the OECD report is the continuous learning on education, which aiming is the building a model for transition management and coordination mechanism on continuous learning to meet the challenging needs for the working life. The second pilot is climate action and finance policy, which aim is to add the anticipatory governance tool for the economic and fiscal policy in transition to carbon neutrality. The third one is the welfare of children and youth, which aiming is to multi-level anticipatory steering mechanism for the future for child well-being here in Finland. The fourth and the last one is trust and dialogue between the politicians and civil servants. And if you allow me, I would end my speech with a little bit of explanation what we mean with this fourth pilot. We think that well-functioning interface with the politicians and leading civil servants is a vital part of the public governance, as there is a joint responsibility of the governance system. Thus, got joint understanding of each other's role, function, and processes and challenging is vital, and the role of administration and politicians is always complex, and long-term policy issues are sometimes unclear, and they are subject to hidden power relations. That's why we need to be very clear on our roles, but our aim is to, through these dialogues, to increase the joint understanding and share sense-making between the politicians and leading civil servants. With these words, I shall end my presentation. I still regret that I couldn't share my screen. I don't know what was wrong, but with these two things, the trust is the heart of the democracy. And I think that future is created through the open and fair dialogue with the politicians and the civil service. Thank you very much for your patience, and sorry for that lack of my presentation.
Ačiū Jums labai ir tai yra.
Thank you very much. Well, it was our organizers' fault for failing to prepare. And now let us move to the last part of our conference. So this is the expert discussion moderated by Giedrius Viliūnas, Director of Strata. And I also invite on the rostrum Professor Raimondas Lopata, Chairman of the Committee for the Future of the Parliament of Lithuania, Mr. Aleksandras Abišalas, Signatory of the Act of Reestablishment of the State of Lithuania, Mr. Egidijus Barcevičius, co-author of the GRC report exploring digital government transformation in the EU, Dovydas Čeilutka, President of Lithuania's Artificial Intelligence Association, and Sigita Trinauskienė, Senior Policy Analyst at Strata. Now, please, if you follow and listen to us, use the Slido platform to answer the questions and to give your questions. Thank you very much for your invitation to participate in this conference and in this discussion. We have a very interesting and provoking situation. We've listened to many presentations, and we've listened to all this information about these regulations, evaluations necessary for politicians. And now we have to speak about anticipatory governance. I was always thinking during those last presentations that all those things mentioned are related, and in governance, the trust factor is very important. It is related to responsibility, to stringency of regulation, mutual trust, and it is closely related to flexibility in regulation. The more regulation we have, this means that we have less trust. and we restrict ourselves, while the environment and all the signals in the environment are about a future that is difficult to anticipate and to regulate. And when you think about our experience in 30 years, after the breakthrough, after the regaining of independence, we've lived in a developmental level, and now it means that anticipatory governance is extremely important. Are we ready for this type of governance? What do we think about this? What does the context tell us, as signalized by the OECD? And what have we learned from the Finnish experience? Now, first of all, I would like to give the floor to Mr. Raimondas Lopata, Chair of the Committee on the Future of the Parliament of Lithuania. Thank you. I think we should have started from the signatory. The discussions are really very interesting and they give food for thought. We praise the Committee for the Future of the Parliament of Finland, but if you not only listen to but read the studies, you can see that they're living through difficult times and they're experiencing many challenges and difficulties. Alexandras will speak in more detail about that. We have some problems with the definitions and concepts. Strategic governance is aimed at depoliticizing political governance. So if we have this understanding, all the lessons that our colleagues tried to teach us are useless, because our anticipatory of future policies are political governance. Experts told us that through regulation, the aim of our future is to ensure deregulation. This is the main aim. All the methods, outsourcing, experimentation, will be useless if we don't have that. So this is the most important idea that I've received. Well, if we want to think about the future, we need thinkers about the future, and we're faced with that, with the problem of that. We have Strata. We have the Institute of International Relations and Political Sciences, and the policy or future policy will be included in the curriculum of this institute. When we speak about politics and the future of politics, we need prepared politicians. Our Committee for the Future showed that we can do that. We have many politicians who read a lot and write a lot. And the discussions are the core discussions that end in certain resolutions or insights are key, and our ideas are used by other committees. And my last thought is we have to admit that despite what Giedrius has said, we have experience in anticipation. We had a strategic analysis center in the past, and we analyzed and forecasted the development of international relations. It was rather progressive. Some forecasts came true. And it actually impacted our governance in Lithuania. Our actions in foreign policy needed actions and reforms in our domestic policy and governance. Is this method important these days? Yes, it is. In future, we will have a Cold War, and democracies will be required to show clear rules and methods of governance. We discussed them in our committee in different informal forums. Some more discussions are needed. Mr. Žeruolis, the problems of horizontal governance. Our governance is based on vertical methods, and all the talks and discussions about the future of our governance will be in vain. Thank you for your attention. Thank you very much. And now I would like to give the floor to Aleksandras Abišala, signatory to the Act of Independence. You have this wide experience in politics and in business. How do we see the change in the foresight of our governance? Well, signatories should be speaking about the past and not the future. When we speak about something new, we have to agree on the concept. The Shakespeare in his sonnet said that no matter how you call the rose, it won't smell less. Regulation is like a regulation of the market when the central bank regulates businesses. In Lithuania, we have another word for regulation. Speaking about the depolitization of the governance, this is related to the fact that in the English language there are two words, politics and policy. In the Lithuanian language, there's no such distinction between these two notions. Politics is an art to gain power, and politics is something different. And those who gain power can change policy. When speaking about depolitization, could mean continuity in the Lithuanian language. Is it possible? Is it an ideal? It is a question. I can see that we can see many different tendencies with 2% of GDP for defense, but it is increasingly difficult to agree because we have many different politicians with different visions, and to retain the essence and not to get into details. And therefore, we have to leave this realization of certain goals to a concrete political force. One more notion. We have the strategy Lithuania 2050. This is not a strategy for me because a strategy has goals, those who implement it. It could be seen as a vision rather than a strategy. And if it was called like this, we would have only the vision of what we want Lithuania to be in 2050. The most important thing is to continue on that. So that some other related documents are made in terms of practical implementation. National development programs and plans created for 10 years. This could be the major strategic planning document that could be focused. If you ask what Lithuania 2050 gives, I can say nothing. We have to do something, starting with yesterday. Actually, in terms of anticipatory governance, 2050 has nothing in common with that.
Now I'd like to give the floor to Mr. Dovydas Šeilutka. He's from the private sector, and he's the president of the Lithuania's Artificial Intelligence Association. I would be very happy if you could reflect on how the area that you represent could contribute to anticipatory governance. Maybe you could answer how the new wave of technology can empower governance. Maybe it already does empower. As you look at the strategy of Lithuania 2050, maybe you see already some of the hints that could bring us to the year 2050. Thank you for the floor. As you have mentioned, I come from the private sector, from the private company. When we formulate a problem, we try to answer what we want to achieve, why we are starting one or another project, and so on. If I clearly understand the problem, we now simply want to take certain decisions, as it has been mentioned, maybe to adopt some policy or maybe amendments to the policy. We have to realize and to understand why these changes are needed and what is the end result of these changes. In order to take the solutions, we have to have information. And most probably, we now come to the data-driven decisions concept. And this concept is one of the most important things that the world of scientists can contribute to governance. Most probably, well, there is no one-sided answer. I have no doubt that people would identify the situation differently. But from all the data of science, I believe that we can make use of the statistical or analytical analysis or causal analysis. But machine learning is not the area that we should focus a lot in order to have more machine learning professionals, because machine learning needs some other tasks. When it comes to artificial intelligence, artificial intelligence is sometimes not very clearly defined, and it sometimes includes only parts of the machine learning. Sometimes machine learning is put into equation with artificial intelligence. So when coming back to your question, what the area I represent can give, how it could contribute to anticipatory governance, my answer is as follows. We can provide the information in order to identify the causal links and the potential implications of what might happen if one or another legislation is introduced. Again, we see that even in the industrial sector, we can't always see what will happen if we adopt one or another decision. So the same might happen in the regulatory area. Now let me give the floor to Mr. Egidijus Barsavičius, who has looked into similar things from the academic perspective. He has contributed to many projects. He is an economist. So what can you say about the evidence-based and data-driven decisions? Thank you for the floor. Shall we begin the lecture on what data can give to governance? When we talk about the anticipatory governance, is a very interesting word indeed. Maybe the English concept itself does not raise the concept that high, but irrespective of that, the problem that we are trying to address means that we are trying to look for ways of governance that would be oriented for long-term period. And this debate is closely related to the first part of the event. So if we have certain problems, we have to address the problems right here and right now. But due to that fact, we increase legal inflation. So we need to be more strategic, and we need to achieve more forward-looking objectives. Well, in fact, the documents that have been prepared by the OECD also mentioned anticipatory governance, and they say that anticipatory governance is not that much about anticipating the future. Well, I would be very happy to be able to anticipate and to foresee the future. If government could do that, it would also be very good. But what the OECD has in mind is the ability to imagine various scenarios rather than anticipating, raising questions about various scenarios. We should look at the distinction between the two. We have to have the ability to imagine different scenarios in order to be able to act in order to achieve the scenario that we are targeting at. When it comes to anticipatory governance, I also have some arguments. So how should we achieve anticipatory governance? My first argument would be about the public sector and about the staff working in the public sector. During the first part of the event, we already we already heard that there is a need for a set of skills. Therefore, my first argument would be, well, analytical skills are very important. Data is very important, but if we think about anticipatory governance, we should also be having not only data, but also imagination. Maybe having imagination is even more important than data. Well, we do have some sort of imagination, but we need to improve it. So we also have to ensure how to bring the people with who are very good at imagination to leave the how to keep those people in the public sector. If we want to talk about anticipatory governance, we also have to look at what has already been done, at what we have already tried to do. We are not starting everything from the scratch. A standard example would be the regulation of fintech sector. When regulating the fintech sector, we had to look at other problems. But then we might wonder why it was previously decided to target the EU money into the broadband connection back in 2005 and 2006. So when talking about foresight, we should be looking at the backcasting. Well, whenever we talk about certain principles that are adopted in the government, what usually here is that one political power was elected, then later on it was replaced by another political power here in Lithuania. So these are usually the excuses for failures. I remember once in one of the Lithuanian universities, we discussed the problems related to the labor market. We tried to offer certain solutions, but still, now we should look at the things that we used to discuss previously. We have to look at what we have failed at. Well, I had many more arguments, but I want to consume that much time of yours. Therefore, I'll soon finish. We already talked about the importance of politics and about inclusion of the people and society into the politics. When we think about the year 2050, we tend to think that the future will somewhat be. It will anyway come. But we can't escape the normative questions. When we think about the future, is not the future that is imagined by some technocrats. Whenever people imagine what future will be like, they will base their scenarios on the values that they have and on their previous experience. Therefore, when talking about future, we have to think about the values as well. Thank you for the very inspiring speech. I believe that we will still have some time to respond to your ideas. I would encourage the audience to engage in the debate. We also have some questions on the Slido platform. And now I'll give the question to Ms. Sigita Trainauskienė, who's a central figure in organizing the Lithuania 2050 strategy. She's a project manager, and she's also the person behind the theoretical reflections when it comes to anticipatory governance. And she can say a lot to us about the situation that we are now and what we are heading towards. So, before you start speaking, I have a question to you. What will be left after the drafting of the strategy 2050? What elements will appear?
Thank you. I will try to briefly react to what has been said. from today's discussion into the strategy. I agree that nothing. The greatest strategy of the nation, it's not about governance, but about changes in social, economic, and environmental spheres. We should discuss what the strategy should encompass. And we try to have a small analysis with our colleagues, both from theoretical point of view. And we criticized the strategy 2030 because it had no external dimension. And the governance aspect is not mentioned in the strategy. And I think that this is one of the issues to be discussed, what we want to have in the strategy. Now, speaking about the methods, I know that the audience is well informed, and I agree with Egidus that one of the most interesting things is imagination and institutionalization of imagination or foresight. And we have a participatory foresight, which aims at involving citizens, population, and knowing their values. So we have already started such discussions with the population by asking them what future they want to see and what future they expect. And we want to involve people who participate in high-level discussion, because we believe is an important component. Speaking about the civil service and its skills, I've opened a law on the civil service because it is a rather strange and very much amended law. I was surprised that creativity is one of the principles of activity in the civil service. I have an experience of 15 years in the civil service, and I haven't seen the promotion of any civil servant for creativity, because very often civil servants are promoted for irreproachable implementation of one's duties. So this reminds me of the Chekhov's character, A Man in a Case. So we need to create a safe environment for experimenting, discussions, expression of strange ideas. Well, the countries that are already doing this, they are not trying to have some clear, correct future visions or future scenarios. But the main environment which is given, there are certain topics that are not always readily discussed in public. I think that competition will not be relevant in 2050, so dissociated discussions will be possible. Communication, I think, is important, and giving freedom is the most important thing. So this promotes free citizens, free population, and I also encourage you to think about creative civil servants. Thank you very much. Now I invite the reactions from the audience or from the panelists on the ideas that were discussed here. Speaking about the law on the civil service, I say that the best amendment to this law could be the dissolution or abolishment of this law because many things are not needed anymore. Future foresight requires the ability to dream and to have visions and analytical skills. And in Lithuania, we lack this analysis of data. And we lack data on why society thinks one or another way. And in order to find the best scenarios of those imagined ones and to move to the actions, we do not know the structure of society, and therefore we do not know how the society will react to that. We have some technical data, we can calculate some technical mathematical things, but we do not have data on the empowerment of the public on society. And this data has been used during the Trump electoral campaign. And it has been used for 10 years in the world. And geopolitical dimension actually is lacking in the strategy. And I think that this should be issue number one. We have to choose the scenarios that really choose the future scenario that actually contains the existence of the European Union, and this should be the best scenario. Well, it is difficult to contribute because everything has been discussed. We have to start the discussions for the Progress Council. We didn't speak about digitalization. Do we have this metadata or just data? Because we need this data not only for governance, but also for carrying out reforms. We need to understand that the reforms that we've started in the portfolio of our Prime Minister, these reforms are made in order to have new reforms later on. We have to accept that this is the world. We started doing that when we were joining the European Union, and we understood that well, and those who are not aware of that have to recognize it finally. Well, actually, I took the microphone. It doesn't mean that I want to say something, but I will not lose the opportunity. Well, my reflection is when we speak about the public or society, how we understand it when we think about the future itself. The society has many groups and interests, and we have many groups. And we think that society contains many groups, rational, irrational, access, and active access. When we think about the guidelines for 2050 and a possible future vision or actions to achieve this vision, and it is not very easy, but how can we embed the society in this vision? This is the challenge, I believe, for us. Thank you very much. I can see that we had a question from the audience, if we had time. Well, we have several questions from those who joined online. one question is as follows. In the first part of the conference, we spoke about evidence. It's like a reflection on the past of what we haven't had. And now we speak about the future, about the vision 2050. How to merge all these things, present, past, and future. And another question is, Finnish experts mentioned civic participation in the future vision. So what are your reflections on the role of the society in future visions? Anyone willing to react to these questions? Well, I want to speak all the time. Well, how to merge the vision and at the past. If I understand it correctly, the science of data is finding links between different individuals or groups of individuals, their impacts and evidence-based decisions could help us to answer the question on the necessary changes of the law so that the greatest part of the society reacts and moves to the direction that we need. This is true about business too. Data science plays a very important role here. But in business, it's easy for us to segment the society or segment our consumers. Well, the last question was about the citizens. I will say clearly, we live in a republic. What is a republic? We allow our citizens to decide on their own. So this is what the republic means. Well, my brief remark, when I hear that we have data and that data can tell you things, it can tell us things about the past. But when we know the past and interpret the data, well, some interpretation is a science or art. But when we think about the future is not something that can be shown by data, because you can draw those lines if you want in different ways, but the future is at least an attempt to think or anticipate the future or the creation of history. When we speak about the inclusion of citizens, this is the creation of common history. And it is important to collect different views and discuss with the public. But moderation of the discussion is a great challenge here, so that all the participants feel at ease in that discussion. So, in my understanding, this is a great challenge and skill that we really need. Thank you very much. I saw Ms. Leontieva. Could we give her the floor? Thank you, Elena Leontieva, Lithuania Free Market Institute. This panel had a very ambitious anticipation of the future, and it linked us with a panel on legislative quality, because the legislator has to navigate between ex post and ex ante and to draw future scenarios based on that, to develop future scenarios based on the past and see which of them complies with good legislation principles. And if our legislators practiced in that, we would have many good quality legislation and think us about the future. Well, the questions were very well fitting for the conclusion of this conference. I think that we had many ideas and categories that complement the first regulatory part of our conference and opens ways for discussion. Well, this brings me to the end of our panel, and I would like to give the floor to the moderator of the entire event.
Ačiū Jums labai.
May I thank all the participants of the conference, both who participated here in person and online. I believe that the conference was very beneficial. The content was extremely beneficial and useful. So in the future, we intend to invite you in different formats as we develop the Lithuanian progress strategy, Lithuania 2050. See you next time.